The 1st of June, Einar was diagnosed with cancer. The 2nd of June, Alice rang up their circle of friends and told them that Einar had been diagnosed with cancer, and to judge by his emaciated state, he had nothing to bring to the fight, so it must be terminal. In any case, it would be best if Einar, who had no wife or children, was admitted to a hospice as quickly as possible. That was Alice's opinion. Her own husband had died in the hospice, and those were his best days, she said on the phone when her listeners had sat down heavily on the sofa or in a kitchen chair with a poor Einar. On the 5th of June, Alice walked along the neighborhood's narrow paved paths to Einar's, where the door was never locked. She went through the yard and into the kitchen, and here she found the invalid with a schnapps and a cheroot. The invalid appeared anxious and apathetic, and Alice met him with warm, thin hands and a steady gaze. Then they smoked together, while Alice told him how to deal with a serious illness. Her father had been a dentist, and there was nothing to be done but take things as they came. Yet Einar had a faraway look in his eyes. He stared at the bird feeder outside the window and said, "When Mother died, a robin appeared at the feeder. It kept coming back that entire winter. It was Mother who was visiting me." That same evening, Alice rang around and said she feared that Einar's cancer had metastasized to the brain. The 10th of June, Einar went to a doctor's appointment with his sister to discuss treatment options. It was in the morning, and what the doctor said was that as long as he drank schnapps, they couldn't treat him. In the evening, Alice called everyone and said that the sister had found empty schnapps bottles and flattened boxes of wine in the invalid's home, but not much in the way of food. "You can't be cured if you don't eat," Alice explained. That's what her father had always said. That's also what she'd always said herself, back when her son was little. You've got to have something to bring to the fight. The next day, Alice went along the neighborhood's narrow paths to the invalid, who sat askew in a chair in the kitchen and talked about all the years he was looking forward to. The future unfolded itself for Einar, and he spoke of it in hazy images. On the table were some tranquilizers the doctor had prescribed. He fingered them and expounded on what was to be planted in the kitchen garden next year. He also spoke about how he was now going to be cured. A woman he went to croquet with on Tuesdays had dropped by with the guide to eating yourself free from cancer. Lemons and baking soda in particular were known to work miracles. The woman had also brought provisions. Alice could have a look herself, and she did. Einar's refrigerator was full of lemons and baking soda, but Alice easily swept the contents into a garbage bag. Afterward, she sat beside him and laid a thin hand over his. "My father was a dentist," she said, "and the only thing baking soda can save is a cake." Later, Alice went home and called up the woman with the lemons. She asked her straight out to pack it in, though she needn't have sounded so harsh. That's what she thought afterward, before she called the others. After all, the invalid had chosen the schnapps over the lemons, and the prescribed tranquilizers lay on the table like mints. To judge by Einar's condition, he wasn't able to figure out his doses. "We just have to hope he manages to get into a hospice," Alice told everyone who was following Einar's last days, and then she went to bed and slept like a rock. Every day, from the 12th to the 19th, Alice went over to see Einar. He was lying in his bed more often now, which made his feet easier to get at. She removed his socks and massaged his feet, lumpy as they were, because it felt so nice. She knew it did. As she sat there at the foot of Einar's bed and talked about her father, who'd been a dentist, about her devoted years as a school teacher, about her deceased husband, and about her son, who'd been sweet as a child, her fingers were busy pinching and patting. The big tom that always hung about Einar was easy enough to shoo off the bed, and it stalked around beneath the bed and glowered at Alice, while up on the bed she spoke of the future. I, for instance, have my funeral completely sorted, Alice told Einar, who floated in and out of a schnapps fog. I know precisely which songs they'll sing. And Einar opened an eye with difficulty and said, But I still have long to live. That's what he said on the 19th of June, but the next day he had an appointment at the hospital. Alice only received a summary because it was his sister who accompanied him to the doctor, and the doctor said there was nothing they could do, that Einar should go home and make the most of his remaining time. Those were his words according to the sister's summary, and in the evening Alice called around the circle and said, Now we have to hope he manages to get a hospice place. Afterward, when she'd hung up the phone, she sat for a while staring out into the midsummer darkness, and without realizing it, she hummed, I get so happy when the sun is shining. A few days later, Einar stopped drinking schnapps. He had no more thirst for schnapps, but he wanted his cheroot and the anti-anxiety drugs. So he sat, with cheroot and water glass, skin and bone, in his kitchen, looking from the dear cat to the feeder outside the window, while his sister tended to his daily needs. Alice appeared at regular intervals in the front doorway, dressed in a black turtleneck sweater, menthols in her purse. Her hair was neatly gathered at her nape. Her feet large, a bit like a crow's, thought Einar, when the Midsummer's Eve bonfires left only Alice to help him use the bathroom. He had to pee all the time, and here's what she said the next morning. Everything runs right through Einar. On the 28th of June, Einar had a birthday party, propped up in an armchair with some outdoor cushions. He received presents and wishes for the future. He received a piece of layer cake, and from a distant acquaintance whom Alice had called up, he received a pre-printed card with the word "Congratulations" on the front in gold glitter. I understand that you've been struggling with your health, the acquaintance had written on the card, but I'm sure it'll all turn out fine. Doctors nowadays are so clever. Einar read the card and tucked it under the glass of water that later would run right through him. In the days that followed, Einar slept lightly most of the time, to the sound of rain on the roof. When Alice stood unannounced one morning in the hall, the sister told her that now they needed quiet, no more visitors. Everyone on the phone list picked up, and Alice said, We've started sending unannounced visitors away, no more callers. Not counting the woman with the lemons, everyone said it was good that Einar had Alice. Alice did not dispute this. She hoped to have someone like herself with her when, someday, she was dying, even though she would prefer to enter a hospice. It was so pleasant to be in a hospice, and that night she dreamt she could fly, lustrous in her black clothes, free she felt, and eternal. Beneath her the plowed fields, the sand beaches, the freeway verges, all of it, now and forever her domain. Yet on the 1st of July, she woke weighted down by a bronchitic cough. On the 4th day of July, Alice met the sister on one of the neighborhood paths, and the sister said that it wouldn't be long now. She asked Alice to go home and wait, and Alice went home and announced, It won't be long now. Late that evening, the family gathered with Einar's comfort and joy, his cat, at his deathbed. Hands were held, a psalm was sung, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, Einar died in his sleep, in the firm belief that he had a future before him. On the 7th of July, Alice had a great deal to see to. She needed information about the funeral, she needed to order a wreath, and she also needed to iron her black gabardine pants. She was in the grocer's several times where she had to tell the same story again and again about how the entire thing had ended so peacefully. As for Einar's beloved tomcat, rumor had it that it sat at the dead man's feet meowing. The rumor caught up with Alice, by the revolving door of the supermarket, and the family shouldn't have to worry about that cat. It was past noon when Alice turned up at the dead man's house with a carrier. The sister seemed red-eyed and relieved, and Alice said, "From now on, the cat officially lives with me." And the mortician who poked his head out from the dead man's bedroom also seemed relieved. It wasn't easy getting the cat stuffed into the carrier. It snarled and scratched her. But once she was home, she put it in the bathroom and called the vet. He had an open spot late in the afternoon, and the cat got its needle and died in its sleep, in the belief that it had a future before it. On the 11th of July, there was a funeral. It was held at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and people came in good time. They drifted into the church to secure themselves seats, as the deceased had been well liked. The nearest relations sat in one of the front pews, and at 1:35 p.m., Alice slipped through the people arriving in the church porch, stepped confidently across the memorial sprays and wreaths, and made her way to the pew closest to the coffin. Then she sat in front of the family, with folded hands, looking at the large array of lilies with their silk sashes. It was a suitably depressing funeral coffee, with rolls and cold cuts, kringles, a dram for those who required it. There was smoking in the yard, and here Alice explained to the circle what had happened in Einar's last days, and what they should remember to be thankful for, that it went quickly, that he'd been free of pain, that the cat had found a new home. Then each of them departed, ready to face their everyday cares once more. And around 11, on that first evening of Einar's everlasting life, Alice plopped down in front of the window by her kitchen table and felt empty inside. A small wren bobbed in the yew beneath the windowsill, and Alice felt as if she were hungry. But no snacking now, she told herself, and then she took out her notebook, wrote, "Einar buried, the cat put down, good one can be of assistance," and turned out the light.
It takes sort of a moment to sort of absorb that story and all the emotions it takes you through listening to her read that. It's such a thrill, Dorthe, to be here tonight, to be able to celebrate you and Wild Swims, and to get to do so with the Center for Fiction and Grey Wolf and everyone in the audience. So thank you for the invitation to be part of this. I wanted to start by asking you about time. It may be that the moment we're in, it seems we've all experienced time in a distorted way this past year, or had a sense of being dislocated from it. And I was struck reading these stories how much it seemed a collection about time. From the first sentence of the first story, it was a matter of time. And listening to Merritt read just now, the way the story marks time, the 1st of June, the 5th of June, on the 11th of July. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you think about that, how time frames your stories, the stories in this collection.
Well, hi, Brigid, and hi, everyone. It's great to be in New York, even though I'm not there. And what a reading by Merritt. It was amazing. I think time has been a very important theme in all my writing. And I think it's been hard for people to tell. I mean, they get focused on relationship problems in the text and stuff. So when I wrote this one, I just wanted to let people know from the beginning that this is about time. So it's a matter of time. And I always like to portray the characters in a time situation where they're even stuck somewhere between the past and the future, or they have different perceptions of time. For instance, in this story that Mary just read, Einar is of course dying, so he's running out of time, but he wants the right to see the future for him, because that's soothing to him. That's a comfort in his in the death process. And that's a free choice. You should be allowed to think that you have a future, even though you don't have one. And so what Alice is actually doing is some sort of violence. She's disrupting his sense of time and his right to have his personal sense of time. She keeps on going back to him and saying, you have no future. In my novel, Mirror Show the Signal, I had a fortune teller describe the protagonist's entire future, after which she forgot it. So she spends the entire time trying to remember her own future, which is also a kind of violence against a person's sense of time. And when I make the psychological portraits of my characters, I always enter them through this sense of time, that very basic structure of existence that we perceive our lives in time. And for instance, if you can't see your past, if you can't remember your own past, you can't predict your future, and so forth, you will have issues with orientating yourself in time.
You mentioned violence, and when Melanie was introducing the collection, she talked about delighting in the humor in your stories, and I'm struck just sort of how you balance or sort of shift between those two moods and how you fit them together. And you were saying, when we had a chance to talk before the reading, about reading this story to other audiences and sort of having a feeling that it provoked something in the readers. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that idea of provocation, and is that something that you think about when you write?
And no, not at all. If I think something is funny, I will write it, or if I think it's on the edge. But when I first read the story myself before audiences, I thought they would all crack up. I thought they would think this was funny because she's a hilarious character. She's off, right? But quite often, especially women in the audience would grow silent, and especially elderly women would grow silent because it's a story that takes caring for others, that immense caring for others, nurturing, nursing, and turns it into an act of violence. That not all nursing, not all caring is about doing good in the world. And that flips something around that you could just tell. They go, oh my God, I helped my neighbor when he was terminally ill. Did I do him wrong? You might have. He might not have wanted that. He might have wished for something else in that time. And also, Alice has a huge identity crisis. She's been a teacher, a mother, and a wife, and all these identities are gone. She's used to have control through nursing and teaching and telling people what to do, and all that is gone. And I imagine that in the community she lives, people would sort of distance themselves from her because her caring has a violent streak to it. But Einar can, of course, not escape. He's chained to the bed. So it provokes people because we're used to saying that caring is always good, but it can be transgressive.
I think can you hear me, Dorthe?
I can hear you.
Okay, I thought I froze there for a second. We'll have time for audience Q&A at the end, but there's a question now that sort of relates to what you're saying. So it's from Yun Lee, and she's a follow-up question about violence against time. And she's asking, how do you see individual violence versus collective violence against individual time versus collective time?
Well, of course, there is a relationship because we live in the world. So right now, time has stopped. We're like frozen. It's very, very hard to predict future. I talk to writers who say that they have a very difficult time writing right now. And I think that's because you have to be able to predict the future in order to write. You have to be able to imagine, to daydream, to do a lot of these things. But that's very hard right now. it's hard to daydream about that trip to Hawaii because you don't know if that will happen. So the future is foggy right now. And that's not because the world is evil. That's just because that's what is like right now. But that, of course, affects us in our daily lives in different ways. And that can feel like violence, I think. Also, before Corona, we lived in high speed. I would say the speed was crazy. You're a little bit frozen now.
And you have a real sense now of time having slowed down.
Yes, time has really slowed down. And I also think that when we look about the time we lived in before the pandemic, I think a lot of us are thinking, wow, what speed we lived on. And that kind of speed and time might not be good for the world as such, but I still miss it though.
You had mentioned both throughout your work and in this collection, several of these stories take place in the aftermath of, to borrow one of your phrases, relationships, the moment when relationships begin to get complicated. I think that's from the opening of one of the stories, Sundogs. And I wanted to ask you about that story in particular, because it's a story about a relationship between a writer and a man named Olaf, and sort of the aftermath of, she sort of escaped from the relationship to a writer's retreat where she befriends Olaf's mother. And it's this really stunning portrait of two very different types of women. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the writer character in that story, and this question of sort of the refrain that comes up throughout the story of the mother saying, "I'm afraid you're going to write about this."
Quite often, my stories have built themselves around one sentence that I hear. And I heard that sentence quite a lot. I'm afraid that you're going to write about me. So apparently the writer doesn't only come as a storyteller in the world, but also as a threat, because what do we see, and how do we perceive that, and will we use it for something? So the protagonist, the writer in this story, is actually stalking her ex-lover's mother, which is a quite creepy and violent thing to do. But it is as if that constant repeating of the sentence, "I'm afraid you're going to write about me," almost invites this writer into the mother's life. It's like if you're saying to somebody, "I'm afraid you're going to write about me," it's like, dangling a pork chop in front of a wolf. It's going to snap at it, right? So, of course, that's a strange relationship between this mother and this ex-lover. And there is a lot of, it's almost as if this mother is a prey for a beast, like a wolf, right? Is the sound okay at your end?
It's a little fuzzy, but yes, I can. Yes, it's fine. Is yours okay?
Yeah, it falls out a little bit. I hope you can hear me.
Can I ask you just about the kind of characters that you're drawn to write about? In this story, the mother Haldis is described as strong in profile yet fragile, which seemed to me sort of a quintessential Dorthe character. And then in another story, there's a character named Lily, and there's this wonderful description of her jealousy and her sweetness, which just seemed vulgar. And I wonder if you could just talk about those two different types of characters.
I think you're right that I'm curious about the personalities and characters who have these contradictions between in them. But we must always remember that the people who say these things about the character is not necessarily to be trusted in these stories. I mean, they might not be like that, but they're perceived like that from the narrator. So one of the things I really like, and especially in the short story as a form, is that it allows me to enter the minds and the inner monologues of people we never hear from, and enter realms of the human psyche that we can't hear in others. I mean, I imagine when people are standing in the kitchen doing the dishes, they have monologues going on inside them. They're thinking about not only the food they're cooking, but also what they stole at the grocery store today. You know, all these awkward, strange human things going on inside us that other people don't hear about. And literature allows me to go in there and actually eavesdrop on that. And in there, I think we're never one-faced. We're both strong in character and incredibly weak and fragile. And we can be both sweet and horrible at the same time.
You talk about eavesdropping on your characters. Years ago, you wrote about a writer named Kirsten Eckman, who had been important to you as a young writer. And you said, I'm just going to read a short, I'm going to quote you to yourself, Dorthe. That I love Eckman's description of compassion as that which is divine in the relationship between people. And then this is Eckman: how wondrous it is that some want to get up early, drink instant coffee, take the bus and soothe, or try to soothe the pain, to heal. And I'm wondering about sort of the idea of compassion in the kind of relationship that you have with your characters. If that's something that factors in.
I do feel compassion for them, even the worst of them, even the psychopaths, even the I don't like the things some of them do, but I understand the human condition that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
And that they're in situations where they don't know how to behave otherwise, or that they are stuck in their solitude. One of the things I learned from Kerstin Ekman is that specific Swedish existentialism that just goes, well, you are alone. I mean, and that's a predicament you share with all the others. So we make life easier because we can feel compassionate to the loneliness of the other, the solitude of the others, and take care of each other when we're fragile, and try and understand. Some of the characters I have, when they're really bad and awful, I would not in real life let them into my house, trust me. But I will let them into my narrative because there's something in that human condition that I also have a strong empathy towards, and which puzzles me and draws me to them. And I want to understand, or at least for those 10 minutes that I allow them to come to life in a story, I want the reader and also myself to be able to approach them and listen. And that's compassion also, listening to even the awful headmaster, for instance, in the story Hughes in this book, who's an awful man. But I think we get wiser from listening in on that too. Yeah.
There are a few questions from the audience about the story that we heard Merritt read that I want to ask while that story is still sort of hovering in our minds. Mm-hmm. Francis is asking, can you talk about the connection between Consulate and a person's right to have their own sense of time/future?
At the Consulate, at the karate shop?
Yes.
Yeah. so that book was written in 2008, and I'm rewinding in time like crazy right now to see if I can remember what I did with time in that book. I think one of the things I would say I worked a lot with time as a form in Karate Chop, because I cut down size dramatically in my own writing, which was also a way of working with time in a different way. But I've written so many books in between that. So to each book, a theme will either disappear or be stronger or be investigated more.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure how to answer that question on a thematical level, apart from the fact that you
So
can.
your early books were longer novels.
Yeah,
And then with the book that we know of as Karate Chop, was that the first one sort of that would define you as a writer of minimalism?
yes, I would say that. But my first three novels, the first one started out fat, then the next one was slimmer, then the third one was quite slim. And then, I'm the only writer in the universe who just gets slimmer and slimmer. It's usually the other way around, but I would say it was. But you can see signs of minimalism starting in the third novel.
What drew you to sort of to that shift? Do you remember?
Finding my own voice, I think. I studied Swedish existentialism. You can't see him, but that's Ingmar Bergman standing up there on the bookshelf behind me, and it's Kerstin Ekman all over the place here. So, but the Danish language doesn't work that well with very serious, deep existentialism. It's a blunt language. It's a short language. It's a playful language. It's a minimalist language. So I think it took quite a few books to find a way to take this Swedish maximalism and put it inside a minimalist form. So when you read me, I think that people sometimes have the feeling that there's some kind of compression going on, that there's something that is trying to burst out of the form from the inside. And that's that's the Swedish tradition, the investigation of time and psychology and stuff. But so I think I actually practiced to figure out a way to have my voice fit in the Danish language. And it turned out that fit very well to the English language, because English came from the Danes, so from the Jews.
Following up on that, Jillian King has a question. Oh, let me scroll back. Wondering if you found any notable differences in how particular audiences respond to the stories. Did Danish readers notice something that Americans missed? Did different languages bring out different aspects of the story?
I think it's surprising how similar they're read, but maybe it's because English literature has a different tradition, but I always feel like I'm being read probably first when I'm being read in English. I mean, the readings I get from the United States and also from the United Kingdom, they kind of get me in the first reading, where it takes a little longer in Denmark before they get it. And I don't know if it's those Swedes running around in my text or what it is, but I would say on the themes that I write about and the people, that's the same all over the place. But there will be some cultures that will dislike certain themes and react to them. And then that theme will be loved in another country. For instance, I've tried that.
I think I noticed your translator in the audience.
He's there. I see
He's here. I'm just curious, were there any sentences or phrases that you and Misha sort of talked about how to render them into English? Any Danish words that don't really have an equivalent in English?
Well, we work very closely together on this translation. It went back and forth.
Yeah.
When we do that, and the problem is that Danish doesn't have that many words. So Danish is all about using the same words and make them mean different things in different contexts. Whereas English has words for everything. You can pinpoint what you're talking about. Whereas a word in Danish can mean 5 different things. So of course we discussed a lot which word in English will be suitable for this kind of blurry Danish word. And that's, great fun about translation, that you can do that. That's really awesome.
Let me ask a couple more questions about the story that we heard read. Dan Walsh is curious about the point of view in the story. Mostly it's from Alice's point of view, but there's a small moment in the middle where we get Einar's view. I wonder why you did this. Was it to give us a break from the harshness of Alice's view?
Or also to see the kind of fear that was in Einar, to see it for a moment, what she looked like from the outside. There's a place I noticed when Merritt was reading, and she did it it was perfect. There's a place where Alice is dreaming, and she's dreaming of herself as a crow that flies like, a bird of death over the world. And that's also a different point of view suddenly in the middle of the text. And it gives the reader or the listener that tiny glimpse of the character from the outside, and from an emotional point of view. Which
yeah, that's striking. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just think that maybe that adds to the empathy with the characters, but it's not something that I plan when I write it. It just happens as I write. For instance, On Narrow Paved Paths is written in one sitting.
Oh, is that true for most of the stories in this collection?
For some of them, it's like they're in an archive. Sometimes I talked to a German short story writer called Judith Herman, and we agreed that we both store sentences, and we can store them for years sometimes. And then suddenly a Sunday in April, we get all itchy and then it just comes out in one sitting. That happens with some stories. So they ripe down there in the archive. And with other stories, it's just a struggle. You go back and forth, and you have to do a lot of editing and stuff. So there are quick bursts and hard bursts, but out they come.
What you were saying about seeing the characters from the inside and from the outside, I think that was sort of something that struck me in Sundogs, and sort of the difference between those two protagonists, the woman who's the writer, and then the mother of her ex-lover. And we sort of have the interiority of the writer, and the mother feels like this we sort of know her as a physical presence, and their relationship is mostly they go on walks or they go on horses through the countryside. And then you have this sentence in the story about landscape, and this is the writer saying this: to me, Norwegian lakes feel bottomless, the landscape unknowable. Such uncertainty must leave its mark on the locals. And I'm just sort of wondering about kind of landscape and setting, both for the characters, how they inform the characters, and also kind of for you as a writer, how your environment informs your writing.
I think landscape and nature is leaving a bigger and bigger impact on my writing, because I live on the North Sea shoreline, and it's a magnificent and raw and big landscape, and you can't live in the world without living in it. So that will of course have an impact on how I perceive the world, that I live right there by the North Sea and have all the storms come in. And I thrive in the landscape. And I also see a lot, for instance, the example that you mentioned there from Sundogs is of course an image in the mind's eye. It's the psychological description that goes through the landscape. and that says something about the constant fear of this mother, of being the prey of this landscape. And again, it's not something that I plan when I write it. I just know that when I get there, that it will give me great pleasure and joy to to write about a little bit about that in that way. I did that in Karate Chop also, where I wrote about the Wadden Sea, which is also this kind of big enigmatic landscape that has an impact on the psychology of the people living in it.
That idea of the characters being prey, that makes me think of the first story in the collection, In a Deerskin.
Yeah.
And this fabulous sentence towards the end, he says he just wanted the feeling of winning, and now he has a view of a landscape at dusk.
And he just heard a wolf, so.
Just heard a wolf, yes.
Yeah.
Let me see, we have a question here about the psychology of your characters, which you draw brilliantly. You also draw spiritual portraits, for example, in Einar's belief in the robin as a spiritual visitor. Do you think explicitly about the religious or spiritual beliefs of your characters?
No, not really. The Robin story is a fragment of something I heard someone say about dealing with sorrow once. That's a common phenomenon, that if you really miss someone, you think that they visit you in the shape of an animal. And also, if you notice at the end of that story, there's a little bird in the yew beneath the windowsill at Alice's place, and that might be Einar. That's my theory. Checking in on the cat and not finding it, but no, I don't think about that. I primarily think of things I pick up as I go through life that has a certain energy to it, and and again, there's something very strong about thinking that your mom is visiting you in the shape of a bird, and it's also very frail at the same time. It just works. It makes my heart beat for that person who thinks that. Yeah.
Can I ask you how you feel your writing has shifted across books, or how Wild Swims fits into the trajectory? More sort of in terms of the themes that connect them, and how your perspective has maybe shifted as you've moved through time as a writer?
I'd say after I had the breakthrough with Karate Chop, which you were involved in, Brigid, my life changed. I started traveling a lot and doing readings in different countries, and my life became much busier, much more fun. So the geography change has an impact on the books, I think. And that's the difference you can tell between my earlier work and this one, is that there's a greater kind of movement in them. But there's always, I just finished a book that is about the landscape from the Skaw in Denmark, and then 1,000 kilometers of shoreline down to Holland, and about memory and time in connection with landscape. And there I could tell, that I'm really drifting into the landscape. I'm going closer in that direction. And that's of course because I live in the middle of it. So in that way I can tell that it's changed, but it's still psychology, existentialism, the search for voices of human voices, and that eavesdropping on the others. I think that's still it.
We have a few more questions about Alice and Einar. Someone's asking, can you talk about whether there is a desire for something in the type of woman Alice portrays to fill her emptiness?
If there's a desire to
I think
fill
if
her,
there's a desire, if your characters are looking for something to fill their emptiness.
Alice is definitely trying to do that. I think that's one of the main things you can say about her, is that she's hungry. I mean, the story starts with says she could eat a snack, right? Because she sits down after this death and after having killed the cat out of mercy, and then she says, "Oh, I feel hungry now." And that's not a physical hunger. That's the need to have an identity, and she needs to control somebody to feel that she's in the world and that she's alive. And I mean, if you in the first story, the man has climbed into a deer stand because he ran away from his wife. He's also looking for something that can fill out a kind of emptiness and give him courage to face the tyrant he's married to and stuff like that. And but I also it's part of my method to meet people right then and at that moment when they are stuck in that void all alone inside themselves. People sometimes come up to me and say, "Oh, all your characters are so lonely." And I go, all people are lonely. Not necessarily without friends and lovers and people they care for and companionship and networking and all these good things that makes life easier to live. But you are so full of stories that nobody else knows about, senses you've had, thoughts that have run through your mind, people you've met, and you can never share these things. These things you carry alone. And that's not a bad thing, but I just like to eavesdrop on those moments and portray them.
I just want to say, for the person who asked the question, there's another story in the collection in Suvist Station that sort of is about kind of another way of filling that emptiness. It's a story that begins sort of after an argument between a woman and her boyfriend, and he accuses her. He says it wasn't genuine, all that love. It was just something she'd fabricated to make time, no, her life pass. And afterwards, she sat there utterly still, and the silence felt like a balm. But now it was time to move on, and the days just kept coming. And that question, or that idea that love is just an invention to fill the emptiness.
Not just the cruelest thing you can say to somebody during a breakup. I mean, your emotions weren't true. Your love doesn't exist. I mean, so they're out there trying to, love all, people with cancer. So they're trying to get money out of poor people in a poor neighborhood in Copenhagen, which is not love, which is slumming, and there's this contradiction of she's in that situation, but she's also completely dislocated from it, and now she's also deeply disturbed about what is love. What is that love? Begging money from strangers, or loving that man who clearly didn't deserve that love because that was a cruel thing to say. And also talking about eavesdropping, I think all people have tried to be in situations where they pretend to have a relationship and be in the situation and having fun, but deep down inside themselves, they're dislocated. They're thinking of something else. They're hiding a sadness or a story that they don't feel like they can tell because they're ashamed or something. And that sort of disruption between being in a situation but not being in it at all, and being alone even though you're with somebody else, was also interesting to portray in that story.
I think we have time for a few more questions. I wanted to ask you about influences, or not influences so much as the writers that you feel connected to, that you feel your work maybe this collection in particular is in conversation with. I know you've talked about Kirsten Ekman, and we can sort of see Mr. Bergman in the back behind you.
He was a great association. He's a latecomer in my life, but I really like him. I like him a lot, so I feel I really think he's a kindred spirit. That's one of them. I was very influenced, as all Danish children are, by Hans Christian Andersen, which is a very boring answer to that question, but that was who we were fed with. And then there are some Danish poets that you wouldn't know. And then there is, of course, the one who's really big in New York right now, Tove Ditlevsen, the Copenhagen Trilogy, a very important voice for especially Danish women writers, and loved for generations of Danish women. And we read her, I mean, when you're 13, 14, you would read Tove Ditlevsen poetry like there was no tomorrow. She was like the door into poetry, the melancholy and the sweetness and the sorrow of your first loves, and then she's just follows you up through your adulthood with her wrecked marriage novels and stuff like that. She's amazing. So go out and buy the Copenhagen Trilogy, and then there are a lot of Swedes that have influenced me. A lot of Swedes.
Maybe as a last question, I'll ask you about the very beginning of the book. Can I call it an epigraph? You can always withdraw a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just sort of why you wanted to sort of introduce or frame the book in that way?
Because I think all the characters in this book are withdrawing. They're either geographically withdrawing, or they're withdrawing from the situation, or from the relationship they're in, or from their morals, or whatever. And the truth is that there's also a threat in that, because withdrawal is good. It's good to be able to pull back and look at things from a distance. But withdrawal also has a terrible flip side of its isolation, of being trapped or being lost. I came to think about it recently with conspiracy theories. It's also a kind of withdrawal that is really dangerous. But you can always withdraw a little further, distance yourself from the world. And that is, of course, both good and bad. So I thought that just wrapped up these 14 stories.
I think that sort of brings us to our end of our evening. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions that people have asked. Oh, do you mind answering just two more sort of story-specific questions from the audience?
Definitely.
One is asking about the backstory for the creation of the unnamed protagonist in Honeysuckle.
The backstory of that?
Yeah.
That's actually a sentence. I remember that there is a sentence in there that brought that on. And I'm thinking like hell now to remember what that sentence is. And apart from that, I can tell that it's also a story that always coming back to me. It's that masculine character who, the less character the woman has, the less all her expressions reflect him. He's a narcissist, right? The protagonist in this story. So he needs her to mirror him constantly. And that's a very brutal thing. And then in that story, there is a honeysuckle, which is talking to one of my absolute favorite short stories in the universe, which is called Honeysuckle. and is a Norwegian short story about a boy that in his adolescence, 13 years old, climbs into the honeysuckle at the gable of a farm, and he gets stuck there. He can't get out of the scent. And I wanted to describe what that masculinity stuck in the scent of a honeysuckle would turn into in a relationship. And that original short story that you don't have to read to understand my honeysuckle is written by the Norwegian writer Johan Borgen. And it's amazing.
And we have one last question about humor. Oh, wait, we have one more question. Hold on one second. In between offices, the character always keeps disinfectant gel, sneezes into the crook of his arm, and is concerned with germs. This makes him a strange or idiosyncratic, and yet now it's normal or essential. I wonder how the story reads differently now than when you first wrote it.
That's really sharp. That's right. But when I traveled a lot, I would see people in airplanes, and I bet you've seen them too, who are incredibly scared of the germs in the you know,
yes.
who would sort of wash everything off and I mean, yes, they're the normal ones right now. And so you're right, that story will read different after COVID-19, and in 15 years it will be normal again.
Or will read differently in yet another way.
Hopefully we've forgotten this and don't have to be that careful throughout our lives.
Dorthe, thank you so much for sharing an hour with us and to Center for Fiction. Melanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Brigid, thank you. And Dorthe, thank you. What a great conversation. Thank you for staying up all night with us and talking with us. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. If you don't have a copy of Wild Swims yet, rush to the chat and click on the link to purchase it. It's a great way to spend winter in lockdown. So once again, thank you both, and thanks everybody, and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Good night,
you.
Dorthe.
Good night. Bye.